Rain slashed across the canyon like knives of silver as the wagon careened through the mud, wheels screaming over the rocks. The horses foamed at the mouth, blinded by lightning, driven by men whose laughter was louder than the thunder. When the door burst open, a woman tumbled out, heavy-set, face streaked with dirt and blood, her arm twisting beneath her with a sickening crack. The coach thundered away without slowing. Her cry was swallowed by the storm. She clawed at the mud, gasping for air, one sleeve torn, the other soaked crimson. Somewhere beyond the roar of the rain, a faint, desperate sound rose, the thin wail of a baby being carried away. She tried to stand, but her broken arm hung useless, pain lighting her nerves like fire. "Please, my baby," she whispered, though no one could hear. The sky split again, showing a figure on horseback emerging through the storm, broad as a wall, coat flapping like a dark banner. His horse stopped inches from her body. He dismounted without a word, water streaming from his hat brim, and crouched beside her. His eyes were steady, calm in the chaos. She looked up at him through the blur of rain and tears. "They took my child. Said a woman like me wasn't fit to ride with decent folks. Said I disgusted them." Her voice broke into a sob. The man said nothing. He simply wrapped her in his coat, lifted her into his arms as though she were made of feathers, and carried her toward the flickering light of his distant ranch. Inside, the cabin smelled of wet wood and smoke. The wind rattled the shutters while he laid her on a table near the fire. She trembled as he cut away the sleeve of her ruined dress, examining the arm with rough but gentle hands. When he straightened the bone, she bit down on a strip of cloth and nearly passed out. He splinted it using a piece of kindling and leather, his movements careful and deliberate. "You'll live," he said in a low, steady voice. "Rest now." She tried to ask his name, but he had already turned away, tossing another log onto the fire. She awoke hours later to the smell of broth and the sound of rain easing outside. Her arm was bound, her body wrapped in a dry blanket. The man sat at the edge of the room, carving a piece of wood into something shapeless, his face half in shadow. He looked too large for the small cabin, his presence filling the space. She watched him for a long moment, studying the quiet in his movements, the kind of quiet that comes from years of loss. "Why did you help me?" she asked softly. His knife paused. "Storm leaves what it wants behind," he said. "Figured you were worth keeping." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "You said they took your baby." She nodded, the memory twisting her stomach. "Men from the stage line. They laughed when I begged. One of them said a cook ought to stay in kitchens, not on wagons." She looked down, her tears wetting the bandage. "They broke my arm when I tried to hold on." The rancher's jaw tightened. He said nothing more, but the firelight caught the flicker of anger in his eyes. By dawn, the storm had broken. Light spread across the plains, touching the hills and the wet grass. From the window, she could see his land, wide and lonely, dotted with grazing cattle and fences that stretched to the horizon. He was outside already, tending to his horse, his silhouette sharp against the orange sky. When he came back in, she had managed to sit up. "You should eat," he said, setting down a bowl of stew. "You'll need strength if we're to ride." "Ride?" she echoed, startled. "You mean to find them?" he finished. "Ain't right what they did." She stared at him, unsure if it was kindness or vengeance that drove him. "You don't even know me." He met her gaze evenly. "Don't need to. What's right's right." As the morning grew warmer, she gathered the courage to ask his name. "Folks just call me the rancher," he said with a shrug. "Never needed more than that." When she offered hers, her voice trembled as though saying it aloud made her reel again. He nodded once. "Well then," he said, sliding his rifle into its holster, "you rest till noon. We ride at sunset." Her heart pounded. The thought of seeing those men again terrified her, but beneath the fear was something new, hope. Someone believed her. Someone was willing to fight for her when no one else had. That night, as the wind sighed through the grass outside, she lay awake by the hearth. The rancher sat nearby, sharpening his blade in silence. She watched the sparks dance from the whetstone and wondered what kind of grief had built that silence inside him. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "They laughed while they hurt me. Said no man would ever look twice at a woman like me." The blade paused mid-stroke. He didn't look up, but his answer came firm and quiet. "They were wrong." The words hung between them like a fragile thread. Outside, thunder grumbled faintly in the distance. Inside, the fire crackled, painting their faces in amber light. For the first time since the storm, her breathing slowed. She watched his eyes soften in the glow, the anger fading into something gentler, something unspoken. When she drifted to sleep, he remained by the fire, unmoving, staring into the flames as if they held the faces of ghosts. He whispered something too low for her to hear, a promise carried only by the wind, that come sunrise he'd bring her child home. The plains outside waited, silent and endless, as if holding their breath for what would come next. Days stretched into a rhythm of quiet endurance. The cook's arm healed slowly, though the ache lingered like memory. Each morning she rose before the sun, her breath visible in the cold air of the kitchen. She stirred pots of beans and coffee, her movements careful, her eyes still haunted. The rancher came in from the stables with his coat dusted in hay, saying little beyond a nod of thanks. Silence became their language, a fragile peace built on unspoken trust. She noticed the way he looked at the world, as though measuring what he'd lost and what might still be worth saving. He noticed the steadiness in her, the way pain had hardened into resolve. The ranch was a lonely sprawl of fences and open sky, miles from any town. 2 young hands worked the fields, quiet boys who followed the rancher like shadows. They treated the woman with reverence, fetching water, offering shy smiles when she burned bread or hummed an old tune. The sound of her humming filled the cabin like a small miracle. She moved with a limp now, her body slower but her will unbroken. Each day she felt less like a burden and more like someone who belonged. In the evenings they ate together. The boys spoke in whispers about the stars, and the rancher listened with that same patient stillness. Once when the fire was low, she asked if he'd always lived alone. He said yes, except for ghosts. When she didn't laugh, he gave a faint smile, almost surprised by it. He told her of the woman he'd buried years ago, of the child that never breathed. His voice was flat, but the pain behind it was not. "That's why I keep the land," he said, eyes lost to the fire. "A man's got to tend something living, or he starts turning to dust himself." Her gaze lingered on his rough hands, scarred, thick, steady, and she thought of how those same hands had lifted her from the mud. "You saved me," she said quietly. "You're the reason I can still hold a spoon." He shook his head. "You saved yourself. I just caught you on the way down." The simplicity of his words moved her more than comfort ever could. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry on the line, a movement caught her eye. A strange mark had been burned into the far fence post, a small horseshoe carved deep into the wood. Her breath hitched. She'd seen that brand before on the coach door, just before her baby was taken. Her hands trembled as she ran to tell the rancher. He followed her back, eyes narrowing at the symbol. "You sure?" She nodded. The wind carried the scent of dust and something darker, fear. He studied the mark, jaw hard. "I know that sign," he said. "Men who use it ride out of Dry Creek Canyon. Rough kind. Smugglers mostly." Her stomach turned. "Then they still have my baby." He didn't answer at once. Instead, he reached out, steadying her shoulder with a hand as warm as the sun-baked earth. "We'll get her back. But you don't go near that canyon without me." His voice left no room for argument. That night she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her child crying under the same indifferent stars. She rose quietly and stepped outside, the cold air sharp in her lungs. The plains were endless, the silence vast. Somewhere out there, her baby breathed, and she vowed to keep breathing too until they were together again. Inside, the rancher sat at the table, carving another piece of wood. When she entered, he looked up but said nothing. The fire painted his face in gold and shadow. She saw exhaustion in him, a man carrying more than his share of sorrow. "You shouldn't stay up," she murmured. He shrugged. "Storm coming. Fence'll need mending tomorrow." She hesitated, then sat across from him. The wind howled against the walls like a chorus of ghosts. "When they took my child," she said, "I thought dying would be easier than living. But when you found me, I realized I still wanted to live, if only to fight." He met her eyes. "That's what makes you dangerous," he said quietly. "The ones who still got something worth fighting for always are." For a long moment they just listened to the fire crackle. Outside, thunder rolled over the hills, low and distant. The air felt charged, as if the land itself was bracing for what was to come. At dawn the wind had shifted. Dust lifted from the valley, carrying the faint echo of hooves. The rancher stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand. On the ridge beyond the pasture, dark shapes moved, riders, slow and deliberate. He watched them for a long time, then turned back to her. "They know you're here," he said. She felt her throat tighten. "What do they want?" "To finish what they started," he answered. Later, when the sun sank and the horizon burned red, a note was found nailed to the gate. It was scrawled in crude letters, "We'll take what's ours back." She read it twice, her hands shaking, the words blurring through tears of rage. "They think my baby's theirs?" she whispered. "They think everything weak belongs to them," the rancher said. As darkness fell, he began checking his rifle. She watched, her fear tangled with something fiercer, faith. When he turned to leave, she reached for his sleeve. "Don't go alone," she pleaded. "They already broke one arm. Don't make me lose the man who mended it." His eyes softened, but his voice stayed calm. "I won't fall easy." Then, almost without meaning to, he brushed a lock of her hair aside, his touch lingering for the briefest heartbeat before he stepped away. The wind carried the scent of rain again, heavy with promise and threat. She stood in the doorway long after he disappeared into the night, her heart beating like the wings of a trapped bird. Somewhere in the dark, thunder rumbled again, closer this time. And in that sound she heard both fear and hope calling her name. Before dawn, the world was a hushed bruise of gray and violet, the kind of silence that holds its breath before something terrible. The rancher saddled his horse without a word, movements steady and deliberate. He left a note on the kitchen table, just one line written in a rough, uneven hand: "Keep the fire lit." When the door shut behind him, the cook stood alone, her heart pounding to the rhythm of retreating hooves. The cabin felt too big, too empty. She stared at the dying embers and whispered to herself, "He'll need light to find his way back." Then she stoked the fire until it glowed fierce and bright, as though willing it to protect him wherever he rode. The sky was heavy with clouds as he followed the canyon trail. The land was wild there, bones of rock jutting through dust, wind screaming between cliffs. Tracks led north toward Dry Creek, just as he expected. He dismounted near a cluster of dying cottonwoods and crouched, tracing the hoofprints with his fingers. 6 horses, maybe 7. He'd faced worse odds, but never with a reason that mattered this much. His wife's face flickered in memory, her laughter, her final gasp. He'd buried her under this same soil. Now, for the first time in years, he felt alive again because this time he could still save someone. Back at the ranch, the cook tried to keep herself busy, washing dishes that were already clean, folding the same blanket twice. The boys were gone to town, and the quiet pressed on her chest until she couldn't stand it anymore. She found his spare revolver hanging by the door, the leather worn soft from years of use. She hesitated, then buckled it around her waist. "You told me to keep the fire lit," she murmured, "but I can't just sit here waiting for smoke." She wrapped her shawl tight and stepped into the cold dawn. By midday, the rancher reached the canyon floor. Shadows crawled over the rocks, and the air smelled of blood and dust. He heard them before he saw them, laughter, coarse and mean, echoing off the walls. Peering over a ridge, he spotted the gang camped near an old barn, their horses tied, their rifles stacked. One man paced near the door, holding a bundle that whimpered faintly. The rancher's heart clenched. That sound, thin, desperate, familiar. The baby. His hands tightened around the rifle. He steadied his breath and took aim. The shot cracked through the canyon like thunder. The guard dropped instantly. Chaos followed, men scrambling for cover, shouting. He fired again, taking down another before they could find his position. Then a bullet grazed his shoulder, spinning him backward into the dirt. He grunted, pressed a hand to the wound, and crawled behind a fallen log. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder and sweat. "Come on, you bastards," he muttered. "Come see what dying looks like." Miles away, the cook pushed her horse harder, the wind tearing at her hair. She followed the trail by instinct, the prints, the churned earth, the broken branch still dripping with morning rain. Her injured arm throbbed, but she didn't care. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. When she heard the echo of gunfire, her stomach dropped. She dismounted, crouching low, heart pounding like a drum. Crawling through the dry grass, she reached the ridge just as smoke began curling from the barn roof. Below, the rancher was surrounded. He'd managed to fell 3, but 2 remained, brutal, grinning men with the same horseshoe brand burned into their coats. "You're a dead man," one sneered. "You and that fat sow of yours." The words hit harder than any bullet. The rancher spat blood and raised his rifle again, though his hands trembled from loss of blood. Before he could fire, a shout cut through the air. "Over here." The men turned just as the cook stepped from the ridge, revolver aimed, eyes blazing. Her dress was torn, her face streaked with dirt, but her voice was steady. "You took something from me. Now I'm here to take it back." The gunfight exploded again, quick, brutal, close. The rancher managed to knock one off his feet, but the other lunged at the woman, knocking the pistol from her hand. She hit the ground hard, pain flaring up her arm. The man grabbed her by the throat, snarling. "You think you scare me, pig?" She clawed at his wrist, gasping for air, until her hand found something heavy, the branding iron by the fire pit. She swung it with all her strength. The smell of burning flesh filled the air as he screamed and staggered back, clutching his face. The rancher's final shot silenced him forever. For a long moment, there was only the crackle of fire and their ragged breathing. The cook fell to her knees beside the small bundle near the barn wall. Her hands trembled as she lifted it. A cry, weak but alive, filled the silence. Tears blurred her vision. "My baby," she whispered, pressing her face to the child's hair. The rancher staggered toward them, blood soaking his sleeve, but when she turned to him, her eyes shone like dawn breaking through storm clouds. "You found her," he rasped. She shook her head through tears. "No, you did." He dropped to one knee beside her, exhaustion carving deep lines across his face. "We should go," he said. "More might be coming." She nodded, wrapping the baby in her shawl. Together they stumbled out as the barn caught flame, orange light spilling into the canyon like sunrise. The heat pressed against their backs, but neither looked back. When they reached the ridge, the world below was a sea of smoke. The rancher swayed, gripping the saddle for balance. "You're bleeding bad," she said, panic edging her voice. He smiled faintly, teeth stained red. "Had worse," he lied. She tore a strip from her skirt and bound his shoulder tight. Her fingers brushed his skin, rough and warm, and for a fleeting second, something passed between them, something wordless but certain. They rode in silence toward the distant horizon, the child asleep between them. The wind cooled the blood on their skin, carrying away the stench of fire. As dusk fell, she glanced at him, his face half-shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. "You could have died back there," she said. "Maybe," he answered softly. "But not before bringing her home." She looked down at the baby nestled against her chest and whispered, "Home." The plain stretched wide and golden before them, endless and waiting. Behind them, smoke curled into the darkening sky like a promise kept. Ahead, the first stars began to appear, tiny lights, fragile yet defiant. He straightened in the saddle, gaze fixed on the horizon. "We'll rest when we reach the river," he said. She nodded, exhaustion and relief mingling in her chest. For now the world was quiet again, but both knew peace in the west never lasted long. The wind whispered warnings through the grass, and somewhere beyond the hills, a new storm was gathering. The dawn came red and trembling, like the sky itself was bleeding. Wind howled across the ranch yard, rattling loose boards and whipping dust through the half-open barn doors. Inside, the cook sat hunched over the cradle where her baby slept, his tiny hand curled against her rough apron. Her arm was still bound tight in splints, twisted by the men who had come 2 nights ago. They'd dragged her from the kitchen, shouting that a woman like her had no right to serve beside a rancher of such stature. They'd called her names, spat near the stove where she had worked. And when she tried to fight back, they'd taken the baby. The rancher had found her in the dirt hours later, bruised, wild-eyed, clutching air. He'd brought her back inside himself. Now he stood in the doorway, hat low, his shadow swallowing half the light. He said nothing at first, just watched her as she fed the fire. Then he spoke, quiet but firm. "They'll be back at dawn." She met his gaze, the flames flickering in her eyes. "Then let them," she said, voice shaking but steady. He turned to the rack where his rifle hung. The weapon gleamed faintly in the firelight. He checked the chamber, loaded 3 shells, and laid it across the table. The sound of the metal clicked sharp through the silence. "They'll come for me too," he said. "They don't like a man protecting what they think should be broken." Her lips trembled. "You shouldn't have to pay for me." He looked at her, expression unreadable. "You cook. You work. You bleed. You're mine to stand for, same as any man here." Outside, the wind was rising again, dust spinning like ghosts through the early light. The baby stirred, then whimpered, and she lifted him to her chest. He was the last proof that tenderness could survive in a world that chewed kindness like tobacco and spat it into the mud. The rancher took his coat and stepped out into the cold. She followed to the doorway, watching as he moved through the mist toward the fence line. Beyond it, the ridge was already dark with figures, 5, maybe 6 riders, their shapes cutting against the light like jagged teeth. He didn't flinch. He just waited, standing tall, his coat flapping against his legs. The men dismounted, guns glinting in their belts. Their leader, grizzled, drunk on hatred and whiskey, spat into the dirt and grinned. "You keep a thief under your roof," he shouted. A fat cook who took more than she was worth. "She took nothing," the rancher said, voice even. "She took pity where it wasn't due," the man sneered. "And you?" He gestured with his revolver. "You're just as filthy for protecting her." The cook stepped forward from the porch. "You broke my arm," she said. "You took my child." The man grinned wider. "We took what didn't belong." Then came the crack of the first shot. The rancher had drawn faster than breath itself. The bullet hit the ground inches from the leader's boots, a warning. But the riders answered with fury, guns flashing, horses screaming. The yard exploded with sound and dust. The cook ducked behind the trough, clutching her baby tight. Her heart thundered. She heard the rancher's voice shouting, calm, commanding, and the echoing roar of his rifle. 2 men fell. The others scattered. When the smoke cleared, 3 lay still in the dust. The others fled toward the ridge, their shapes swallowed by distance. The rancher's shoulder bled through his coat, but he didn't fall. He just stood breathing hard, jaw set, eyes dark with something like sorrow. The cook rose, baby trembling in her arms, and walked to him. Her fingers touched his sleeve. "You're hurt," she whispered. He shook his head. "It's nothing." She looked around at the bodies, then back at him. "They'll bring more." He nodded. "Then we'll be ready." For a long moment neither spoke. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder and blood, mingled with the faint sweetness of hay. She reached for his hand, the same hand that had pulled her from the dirt, that had held her child as if it were his own. "You didn't have to do this," she murmured. He looked down at her, his voice raw but steady. "Maybe I did. Maybe I was waiting for something worth standing for." That night they buried the dead near the ridge. The earth was hard and cold, but he worked until it gave way, sweat streaking through the dust on his neck. She stood beside him, holding the lantern, her baby asleep against her chest. When it was done, they said no prayers, just silence, broken only by the wind. Inside the house, he sat by the fire, staring into the flames. She came quietly, placed a cup of water by his hand, then sat beside him. He looked at her face, the bruises fading now but still visible. "You could leave," he said. "You'd be safer in town." She shook her head. "Safety's not the same as living." He looked at her a long time, then reached out, tracing his rough thumb across the bandage on her arm. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was something truer, heavier. The kind of touch that said, "You're seen. You're not going anywhere alone." The baby stirred again and she hushed him softly. "He'll grow up strong," the rancher said. "He'll know what real courage looks like." She smiled faintly. Maybe he already saw it today. Outside the wind settled. The horizon burned low with orange fire, fading to indigo. Somewhere in the far dark, a coyote howled. The rancher leaned back, exhaling slow. The cook closed her eyes, resting her head against the chair. And when the flames dimmed to embers, the storyteller's voice might have said, "That's how the quiet ones survive out there, not with bullets alone, but with the kind of love that doesn't need words." Then the screen fades to black, the fire crackles, and a low voice adds, "If you felt that heat in your chest tonight, you know what to do. Pull up a chair next time. There are more stories still to tell."